I want to glue these boards together, but there are gaps between the boards on some spots. How do I get these edges straight? I'm going to make a joint or taper jig. I'll start with this piece of 3/4 inch plywood. This piece is about 14 inches by 22 inches. I'd prefer it were the full depth of my table saw, but this is what I've got and it'll do. My plan is to put a miter bar on the bottom of this board to keep the cut straight and route 2 channels or dados into the plywood where I'll insert T-track clamps to hold down the board I need to cut. I'll mark a center line for reference position of the miter bar and then mark 2 lines at about 5.5 inches from both ends for the track clamp channels. The length of the dados depends on the size of the board, but need to end 1.5 to 2 inches away from the edge. After I attach the miter bar, I'll be cutting one side of this board off, so I need to take that into account when marking and routing the dados. If you're following along, your saw may be different than mine, so check the distance from your blade to the miter track and adjust your measurements as necessary. I'll be using a plunge router with a 3/8 inch bit to route the dados. My router base is 6 inches across, so I know the center cutting position of the bit is 3 inches. I'll mark a line 3 inches away from the dado line and clamp a straight-edged board to the line. Now I can use the straight edge as a guide for the router. I don't want to try and plunge through the entire thickness of this board in one go, so I'll set the plunge depth to about 1/8 of an inch to start and use a few passes, lowering the bit each time. After clamping the board to my table saw / workbench, I swear I'm going to build a workbench soon, I'll start the dado, keeping the router pressed against the straight edge and being sure to stop at the end mark. After I've got the dado all the way through, I'll switch to a 5/8 inch bit and route a 1/8 inch deep dado to accommodate the head of the T-bolt. Now I'll drop in a bolt, checking that it's flush with or a little below the top of the plywood, and that it slides back and forth smoothly without being too loose. Next, I'll attach the miter bar to the back of the jig. These are 3D printed miter bars, and my printer isn't big enough to print a full bar, so I'll use 2. I'm using some pennies to raise the bars out of the track a little, and using painter's tape and super glue to temporarily attach the bars to the back side of the board where the T-bolt heads will be. I've extended the center line mark from earlier to the edges of the board, and I'll use these marks to align the board with roughly the center of the miter track. This doesn't have to be perfect, just as close as possible. Then let the glue dry for a minute. The board is kind of hard to pull up because of the tape stuck to the table, but eventually it releases. I'm going to use a countersink bit on the screw holes to ensure the screw heads are flush with or just below the top of the bars. This will allow the bars to sit flat in the track and slide smoothly. I'll also drill the screw holes a little larger in the bars. I want these holes to be large enough that the screw fits easily through the hole. If the hole is smaller than the screws, it will cause the plastic to expand when it's screwed in, making the bar too tight in the track and it won't slide smoothly. Now that the holes have been drilled, I can remove the tape and attach the miter bars, but it appears I have made a mistake. Although pre-drilling screw holes into the plywood is a good idea, I've drilled the larger holes into the plywood and now the screws won't hold. But all is not lost. I've had this problem before because occasionally I'm an idiot, and I know I can fill the holes with cooking skewers and wood glue, and it's like it never happened. After letting the glue dry for a bit, I cut off the wood skewers and sand them smooth. Good as new-ish. I'm also realizing that after adding the countersink to my holes, my 1-inch screws are a little too long and just poking through the other side, which I don't want, so I'll use these 3/4 inch screws instead. If you're enjoying this build, please like and subscribe. I'd love to hear from you in the comments too. Maybe let me know your favorite jig or a project you'd like to see next. Now I'll have to go through the whole process of sticking the bars to the board again. Pennies in the track, insert the bars, tape over the bars, but this time I'll cut the tape with a razor knife so it doesn't stick to the table. Okay, tape on the back side of the board, a few drops of super glue, align the center marks with the miter track, let it dry for a minute, and voila! This time it was easy to lift out of the track since I cut the excess tape from the bars. These screws are pretty small and short, so I'm not going to pre-drill into the wood. I'm going to screw down the bars, which will leave holes in the board that I can use to realign the miter bars after removing the tape. Now I'll permanently attach the miter bars and test that the jig still slides smoothly in the track. If it doesn't, remove the bars and sand the edges a little and retry until the jig slides easily without any overly tight spots. Up next, I'll cut one side of the board off with the jig and the miter track, giving me a zero clearance edge. This way, I'll know exactly where the blade will cut a board attached to the jig. I'm putting some tape on the top and bottom of the plywood where the cut will be to avoid any tear out or splintering. After this cut is made, I'll insert the T-track bolts with hold down clamps. I made these out of some hardwood scraps I had lying around. And this jig is ready to use. I just need to place the board that needs a straight edge on the jig and align it so that it hangs over the edge on both ends enough to remove the curved or damaged edge. Tighten the clamps and run it through the saw. And it works great, giving me a straight, square edge. After cutting both sides of all the boards with the jig, these boards fit tight against each other and will glue up nicely. But what if I want repeatable cuts or tapers on several boards? For this, I'll need a fence for this jig. I'm going to use this piece of 1x3 cedar board. It doesn't really matter what wood is used as long as it's pretty flat. I'm going to go through a similar process as with the dados for the base and route 2 dados down the center of this board, leaving a spacer gap between the 2 dados that's 2 inches long. I don't want one long dado because I'm afraid the board will bow in the middle under pressure and not maintain a true straight edge. This time, I'll use a trim router with an edge guide attached. After routing the dado and groove for the bolt head, I insert a bolt in each dado as well as the bolts from the base. I already see a problem with this 1x3 board. The hold down clamps aren't long enough to hold the board as securely as I'd like, so I'll use this jig to cut the board thinner. Measuring and putting a mark on both ends of the board, I can then align the marks with the edge of the sled and cut the board to the exact size I want, which is 1 inch from the dado. Now the hold down clamps are long enough for a secure grasp, and I know the edge of the fence is perfectly straight. So how do I use it as a taper jig? Pretty simple. Mark where you want your taper to begin and end, line up the marks with the edge of the jig, tighten the clamps, and make the cut. To make this cut repeatable, I'll use one of the clamps to act as a stop block at one end of the board. Then rotate the board and make the other 3 cuts. This is useful for making tapered legs for furniture, though I'm not really into furniture making, at least not yet. I've seen people glue a stop to the end of the fence, but as mentioned earlier, I'm occasionally an idiot and I'd probably end up unintentionally cutting it off. The track clamp makes a great stop if it's tightened down well. A few things to keep in mind here. Equal tapers on each side of the board will only work if the board you are tapering is square on the end. And when making cuts on small pieces close to the edge of the jig, be sure the hold down clamps are out of the way of the blade so they don't get cut off. Oh, I have another idea. I'm going to mark lines at 1/8 inch intervals across the jig that I can use for alignment without having to measure every time. I know it isn't perfectly accurate, but I can definitely use it for close estimation. Overall, this is a great addition to my table saw jig arsenal and solves my joining problem on smaller projects. It won't work for joining long boards, but it can accommodate boards up to 2 feet long, 10.5 inches wide, and 2.5 inches thick. It allows me to cut tapers on boards that are too long for my crosscut sled and is much safer and more accurate than using the table saw alone. Thanks so much for watching. Be sure to like, subscribe, and share with other DIYers. Leave a comment below if you have any questions or just to say hi. I always enjoy hearing from y'all. And as always, talk to you in the next episode.